Good afternoon, everyone. Well, there's still some people joining, but I'm thinking maybe we'll just get started and they can pick up on the session as we get through things. So thank you very much for joining, no matter where you are in the world, morning, afternoon. The webinar that we will be running for today is 5 steps to avoid Salesforce data loss and getting back on track. So I'll be your host for this afternoon. My name is Ross Hook. I look after strategic sales for the APAC region at AutoRABIT. Joining me in today's session is my colleague Vignesh. Vignesh, maybe an introduction from yourself?
Sure, Russ. Hi, everyone. This is Vignesh. I work with AutoRABIT as a pre-sales technical lead. I've been with the company for a little longer than 3 years now, and it's exciting to be presenting this webinar to the participants. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much, Vignesh. Um, well, look, maybe without any further ado, we can get started and get us into the presentation itself. So I trust everyone can see the introductory slide that we've got up on the screen, and we're just going to be flipping to the next screen. Any issues with that, please let us know. Also, just to flag it to you, what we will be doing is raising a couple of polls in today's session that'll pop up. I'd love to get your input as we go through it. Any questions that you've got at the bottom of your screen in the menu area, there's a Q&A option there. If you could log any questions that you might have in there, that'd be fantastic. We've certainly allocated some time at the end to hopefully address any questions that might come up. Okay, well, we'll get underway with things straight away. So imagine losing access to all of the computers in your company. That's essentially the effect of a massive data loss. So losing access to your system data disrupts operations, negatively impacts your customers, and takes your team members away from their daily tasks in order to restore what was lost. Now, it's reported that 96% of businesses experience some form of outage over the course of 3 years, and a further 55% of companies experience 5 or more outages over that same period. So there are some essential steps you can take to mitigate these risks, but the threats are constantly evolving. And you need to have a plan in place to prevent data loss events, as well as an emergency plan for restoring operations should you lose access to your data. So data loss events are difficult to address because they come in a variety of different causes. The effects of these are various, and the data loss events, however, are similarly detrimental. So it's been calculated that an hour of downtime costs anywhere from $8,000 for a small company up to $700,000 for a large enterprise. So more concerning is that on average, it takes about 206 days to detect a data breach. So I'm just going to pop up a quick poll here. Have you experienced any data loss in your organization? And if so, how long did it take for you to detect that? So we'll just keep that one put into the corner there. Um, so data loss comes in many different forms, which also means it can come from a variety of sources. So the effects of data loss will always be harsh no matter the source. So it's best to be aware of all the potential causes for data loss. So adequate protection begins with a recognition of any and all vulnerabilities. You're never going to be able to prevent something you aren't aware of. So here are some of the major threats to plan for. The first is software corruption. So software can become corrupted when systems are improperly shut down or there's an unscheduled power outage. This damages the software and might make it unable to run again, losing the data held within it. Hardware failure, another main source of data loss. This can be something as simple as mishandled hardware or overheating. Hard drives can crash, losing all of the stored data. Cyber attacks. Um, Malware and phishing are the most common types of cyber attacks, but of course, ransomware events are also on the rise. Theft. Disgruntled employees or competitors can actively target your important and sensitive information. And lastly, there is simple user error. This accounts for almost half of all Salesforce data loss events. So accidental deletions are the simplest and most frequent type of data loss relating to user error. And of course, there's also users falling victim to phishing and malware attempts, or even neglecting just to simply update the system. Every industry is going to have sensitive information that needs to be protected. However, there are some industries, such as banking and healthcare, that are subject to regulations that stipulate exactly how this sensitive information needs to be handled. So failure to properly protect sensitive customer information can make your organization in breach of these regulations. A data loss event can result in fines, lost revenue, and possibly most seriously, lost customer trust. Regulations or not, however, these considerations apply to every industry. I'm now going to hand over to Vignesh to take us through these topics in more detail. Vignesh, over to you.
Thank you, Ross. So what we are going to look at in this presentation is a couple of things, right? Obviously, we will cover some of the best practices to avoid Salesforce data loss, but sometimes it's not about all about data loss, right? It's about how we protect metadata within Salesforce as well. So as important as data PII is, it's also equally important to protect metadata and make sure that we promote only the healthiest of codes into the higher environment. And throughout this particular webinar, we'll look at why metadata and data are equally important. And coming to focusing specifically on data loss here, what are some of the best practices that we as an organization can follow so that our employees are very well protected both internally as well as from external cyber criminals? So these are some of the best practices that are listed down. Firstly, we have to understand what are the attacking surface areas when it comes to understanding the vulnerabilities within a system. And once the attacking surface areas are identified or the loopholes are identified, we have to be able to prevent it. So any external APIs that might be talking to a HTTPS a server, it has to be very well protected so that you don't allow internet traffic inbound if that is the case. And similarly, once we have those loopholes figured out, we'll have to protect it from cyber criminals. That's where the encryption techniques come into play. That's where monitoring comes into play, and so on and so forth. And it's also equally important to frequently update your software, making sure that it has the most recent version of not just the software, but also the security updates and the network patches as well. And when it comes to Salesforce, we perform a lot of migrations in the form of deployment of metadata and migration of records within Salesforce, right? So whenever we migrate anything from either a Salesforce to a Salesforce environment or from an external system to Salesforce, we have to make sure that data is consistent throughout. And the same applies to metadata as well. And finally, there's employee best practices, which we will have a detailed look at in a few minutes. So the first point is understanding the vulnerabilities, right? How do you go about it to start? So with respect to identifying the loopholes in a specific server or a system, it's primarily important that we run a system audit. It can be an internal auditing or an external audit with another organization where you assign something called sensitivity labels to the subjects. So when I say subjects, it can be your storage layer, it can be your networking layer, virtualization layer, or the application itself. So it can be a middleware application or the physical layer where you apply these or assign these sensitivity labels to those components, and you make sure that you detect what's the through which endpoint the attacking surface area is more. So that's a primary point to understand. We got to be able to separate out the different components within a specific server. And also we have to record the outcome of any event. So for example, let's say internally we run through a test of a man in the middle attack, right? Just to make sure that our systems are well protected, we have to be monitoring those events, and we have to record the timestamps and outcome of such an event as well. And this goes without saying, but the usage of authentication mechanisms is really, really important. So if your system should not be communicating to internet, which is outside of your corporate network, then you should not be using a HTTPS connection to any of the external systems. But if the connection to an external system is required, which is most often the case, and some of these systems are in the cloud, right? Then we have to make sure that the connection is secure, either via a VPC endpoint or a VPN tunnel, if you're going with AWS or similar technologies in other cloud providers as well. And lastly, we have to make sure that these practices are implemented in the form of compliance standards as well. So if I'm working with, let's say, or rather if my organization is working with a lot of cash card industries, then I have to make sure that the software is PCI DSS compliant, so that it gives the confidence in our customers, that the platform is secure because they're already certified in so and so standards. Once we identify these surface areas that has a lot of potential attack, right? The second goal is to kind of protect these attacking surface areas, and that's where we guard against cyber criminals. And this point is very important in in avoiding data loss. The reason I say that is it's not just protecting yourself from external hackers or cyber criminals. It's more about protecting yourself first and then be protected by them, from them rather. So what I mean by protecting yourself is we have to make sure that our employees have access to whatever is required within the system. So in Salesforce, we talk about profiles and permission sets, right? Not everyone has an admin access in the production environment. It's something that's not recommended as well, because for ease of promoting features up to the production environment, sometimes they can log in directly to prod and start making changes, which is not at all recommended. So access settings are crucial. We have to ensure that the employees within the organization have appropriate access settings to that particular software or application. And the login history to that application should be frequently monitored to see if there's any suspicious activity or not. And also, when it comes to protecting from cyber, or being protected from cyber criminals, we have to make sure that we use proper reports and protocols as well. So when we talk about protocols, one such protocol that comes to mind is TLS, or the transport layer security. As you might well know, we have started to move from SSL into TLS and started to standardize version 1.2, 1.3, so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that we need to have some sort of certificates with respect to traffic flow from a certificate authority, and not used self-signed certificates. The reason with that is when you use self-signed certificates, the connection is not secure because there is no authentication that's required for a self-signed certificate. So it's kind of important to understand some of those points when it comes to guarding against cyber criminals. And as mentioned previously, it's also important to understand that any software there is has to be frequently updated. Let's take Salesforce into consideration here, right? With respect to Salesforce, they're currently in version 51. They're going to go up to version 55, 60 at some point in time. What if we are still in version 45? Some of the metadata types are not supported in version 45. Some of the metadata types were not even in beta in version 45. So it's not just for the sake of the applications upgrade that we have to promote to a higher version, but Salesforce or any other application, right? They will add in some network patches, some security patches, making sure that their application is secure at almost all times against the latest attacks that might be in the ecosystem. So it's important to frequently update the software and make sure that we are protected from cyber criminals. And when we say frequently update, this kind of includes Salesforce metadata as well. Like I said, it's not always about data, right? So when it comes to Salesforce metadata, how do you update it? This is where concepts like code coverage, static code analysis comes into play. So when you run unit tests, you don't necessarily want your unit tests to just pass the minimum threshold, if I may. You wanted to get beyond 75%. Yes, that's the minimum threshold, but you also wanted to go beyond 80% at some point in time. Make sure that all your code together works great and it's also healthy at the same time. And that's where we leverage static code analysis solutions as well, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes. And the fourth point that we want to kind of highlight here is how do you make sure that you don't have any sort of integration or migration errors? Typically, with these errors, it, it often relates to data inconsistencies between two environments. Let's take a scenario, right? Let's suppose we have an SAP environment in which we have some account records that needs to be referenced within the Salesforce environment, or rather, that needs to be migrated to the Salesforce environment. If that's the case, then we have to make sure that the external IDs are properly configured when it comes to that data migration, so that we're not potentially migrating any duplicates, but only making sure that records that are already there are being updated, whereas records that are not there in Salesforce are being inserted. So we have to properly map our fields and also make sure that the external IDs are appropriately configured, thereby reducing the migration errors. Same applies with integration errors as well, in the sense that when you migrate metadata, or rather deploy metadata from one environment to the other, you got to consider the dependencies in metadata as well. And that's where AutoRABIT helps identify those dependencies. And once the package is put together with dependent components, you can then confidently promote it to the higher environment. So that's probably one of the ways where you might face some data inconsistencies if migrations are not done properly, and it might lead to potential openings in terms of attacking surface areas. And lastly, but not the least at all, is employee best practices. So when it comes to employee best practices, it's important to understand that access settings are very crucial. Something like a profile or a permission set within Salesforce should be leveraged to its best to ensure that people have proper access to the orgs or sandboxes within an environment. And also, we have to make sure that encryption is used at all times. And what I mean by that is when you typically use a username or a password, uh, you, most of the organizations do not actually rotate their passwords very often. They might rotate it once in 3 months or so, but that is not the recommendation from the industry. The recommendation is that if an organization is using username and passwords, it is suggested that they rotate it once every 30 days. And if you're using something like a personal access token, which is consisting of a larger number of bits and is a little more secure, or more secure than passwords because they're encrypted as well, then you need to have a rotation policy of 90 days. Change the token or key once every 90 days. And also, we need to set some password policies as well. Never accept something like a 12345 as a password for obvious reasons. So password policies along with rotation policies for tokens or passwords are equally important. So now that we looked at some of the best practices to avoid Salesforce data loss and also metadata compliance, if I may, let's see if there is any such loss. How do you get back on track, right? So with all these best practices, it is definitely not assured that you're going to protect your data and metadata 100% of the times. Definitely not, but it gets you as close as possible to that 100%. So if there's any such discrepancies in metadata and data, how do you get back on track? Like we said, best practices aren't always a guarantee, right? So when it comes to data loss, not just within Salesforce, but with any ecosystem, there's always a couple of metrics that's associated with any disaster recovery or business continuity processes, which is RPO and RTO. So RPO is the recovery point objective, where it dictates the maximum period of data that you're willing to lose in the event of a data disaster. So how much data are you willing to use as an organization if a disaster happens in case, right? So RPO can be as high as possible. It's actually good to have an RPO number as high as possible, just to make sure that your business still runs even in the in a data disaster scenario. And likewise, when you talk about RTO, this metric has to be as minimal as possible, because it tells you how fast one can recover from a disaster to normalcy operations. And it's ideal that we have this number within just a few hours and not have a turnover time of 24 to 48 hours, right? And this is exactly where AutoRABIT steps in, right? So when you talk about data loss, how to avoid data loss and how to avoid metadata loss as well, these metrics play an important role. And with the help of Vault, which is a data backup and recovery platform that AutoRABIT offers, we have an RTO of up to 4 hours and an RPO of up to 24 hours. So that would mean that we can recover data as fast as possible for a large data volume of size 150 GB. And we can also do more than just data backup and recovery. As you can see right here, the Vault solution helps you with metadata as well as data backup and recovery. So it helps you take these backup snapshots from a Salesforce environment, and you can store these backup snapshots in a cloud environment of your choice. So it can be an AWS S3 bucket, it can be an Azure Blob Storage, or if you want to protect it within your private infrastructure, not expose it to any of the clouds, then we do support on-premise storage in the form of SAN servers and NFS as well. And apart from taking a backup and being able to perform a restore, you can also compare multiple backup snapshots. How do you typically do that? Let's say you take a backup a week ago and then a backup was taken yesterday. You can compare these two snapshots to find the differences in these backups, and only the differences can then be restored back to an environment. So the backups that you always take at the beginning, they can be either a full backup or an incremental backup as well. So the number of API calls that we make to Salesforce are very, very less, just because we use an optimized API approach, and also because of the fact that we support incremental backups. And of course, apart from these two, like I mentioned earlier, we do support data archival as well. So if at any point in time you have a feeling that your Salesforce records are kind of populating more and more a space in the Salesforce environment, and that you need to back them up to a Salesforce to a secure storage rather, then you can take advantage of the data archival functionality as well. And more importantly, when it comes to security compliance, we are compliant with ISO 27001 and SOC 2, Type 2, and HIPAA and GDPR as well. And what's a benefit of such a system, right? We talked about a Vault, we talked about some of the features that it offers as a backup and recovery platform. And it's equally important to understand the benefits that come out of such a system. So Vault is scalable. What I mean by that is, if a production environment is in MBs or is in minimal GBs, let's say 1 or 2 GB with minimal files and attachments, that will work very well with Vault, as well as a large data volume of around 600 or 800 GB as well. So it's highly scalable and also gives you the security to store backup snapshots into your own on-premise servers. And more importantly, when it comes to the type of metadata that's being supported, we support pretty much everything that MD API offers. So in terms of data, in terms of metadata, files, attachments, and pretty much everything, we do support backup of those metadata and data elements, and also timely recovery of those into the target sandboxes or production environments. And one of the main advantages of this particular platform is the fact that when you perform a restore, or when you take a backup, or even an archival, right, we always consider the data relationships during such an operation. So when you, for example, take a backup of, let's say, opportunities, right? The opportunities should include a line item. They should include contracts, accounts, contacts, and multiple other dependencies that you might have custom built within the organization. So we automatically taken those dependencies from the data schema and take a backup of the complete package, if I may, including lookup relationships, master detail, which includes the junction object relationships as well, and self references are included during backup and restore and archival as well. And coming to why use such a platform, and Salesforce already offers backups, right? In fact, Salesforce kind of went back earlier last year to tell that restores are not supported, but then looking at the demand that they have reintroduced the support for restores as well. But with respect to Salesforce restore, even though they are doing a good job, it still takes a lot of time for you to restore the data back into the Salesforce environment. And it's also a little expensive, or actually rather more expensive, to perform such an operation from a backup snapshot. So again, going back to the metrics, right? You have to make sure that with any backup and recovery platform or support, the RTO and RPO are always maintained. You don't want to wait too long for business to return to normalcy. Hence, the time it takes to recover data is very, very important. And that's where a solution like Vault comes into play. So we've been talking a lot about data so far, and kind of stepping into a different set of shoes here, talking about metadata and how important it is to have a healthy metadata in the Salesforce environment. Let's take a scenario, right? Let's consider a Salesforce environment that has lots of Apex classes, maybe 700 or 800 Apex classes in the production environment. So you have to make sure that these classes satisfy the minimal code coverage percentage of 75%. And you also have to satisfy some of the best practices when it comes to development. For example, if you talk about an Apex class, you have to ensure that you don't follow lots of looping statements. That way you reduce the cyclomatic complexity of that particular Apex class and promote it to the higher environments. Again, how does that matter? It matters in terms of processing speed. So when you have a lot of for loops, obviously the processing speed is going to be a lot slower compared to just having one, for loop trying, or while loop. It can be anything, trying to perform the same functionality as multiple loops. So metadata, the way that we build metadata is equally important as to how we protect data as well. Because when metadata it goes beyond our hands, let's say if the code coverage falls below 75, then it leads to slower delivery into production. Our features get delayed in the sense that they don't appropriately reach a production environment on a monthly basis. So we might have to push our releases to our end customers, which is not always a great experience. So it's equally important to protect your metadata as much as you protect data as well. And one such integration that AutoRABIT has recently acquired as well is CodeScan. So CodeScan is a static code analysis solution, or an SAST platform, where you get the flexibility to test your metadata changes to see if they follow best practices or not. So you can set up your own set of rules. For example, if you want to test your Lightning components against a set of standard rules that the industry recommends, you can go ahead and set up those custom rules or standard rule sets within CodeScan, and you can use AutoRABIT to be able to integrate your source code and validate them with those best practices. And what this offers at the end of the day is it helps you have high visibility into the code, meaning you get to know what violations you're facing for a specific set of code level changes like VF pages or classes or triggers. And it also reduces the technical debt, meaning you work on your errors then and there without having to wait till the last and then resolving all the errors at once. So it's more like following a shift left technique within DevOps, if I may, where you're not just focusing primarily on the DevOps processes, but you're kind of bringing in security with a tool like CodeScan as well. So it's more like following DevSecOps and kind of going in compliance with the shift left approach as well. And obviously, when you have appropriate metadata with proper um, health within them as well, then it's definitely going to increase the feature delivery into the production environment as well, as much as it increases security. And this is something that we have already seen, but what should be the takeaway from this particular presentation here, right? So the takeaway is the fact that we cannot always be 100% certain that our data is secure and that our metadata is secure. That's probably not going to happen. The reason I say that is, as much as security measures and security techniques are evolving as and when years go by, right? There's also hackers or cyber criminals trying to adjust their hacking techniques to ensure that some of the encryption techniques get bypassed and they're able to get their data out of the systems. So just to give you some statistics into that, the breaches alone, the security breaches have increased by 67% since 2014. So if you look at the top organizations like, uh, you know, um, uh, Google, MySpace, Facebook, WhatsApp, so on and so forth, they've all been exposed to some level of security breaches. And since 2018, this number has gone up as high as 11%. And what's more interesting is the number of records that's been exposed in 2020 alone. So if you consider just the first half of 2020, right? There's close to 36 billion records that have been exposed from these systems that we are talking about. So security breaches are happening day in and day out because external cyber criminals are always trying to adjust their hacking techniques as and when security evolves. But the one takeaway from this is, let's talk about the scenario and probably get to that takeaway here. If you consider 20 years before, let's say in the 1990s, where SHA used to be one of the most secure hashing techniques that ever is, where you can use it for one-way hashing of passwords and any other secure strings. Currently, if you look at SHA, it's not as secure as it was earlier. The reason being, the hackers have found a way to get past it. And that's why SHA has introduced it's a 512-bit support. It's 1024-bit support. That's why SHA-2 has come into picture. So it's important to understand that we're not always 100% secure at all times, but it's also important to follow some of the best practices to get as close to 100% as possible.
Thank you very much for that, Vignesh. Greatly appreciate it. So just as a reminder, there is a Q&A button in the menu bar of the screen. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to log them in there. I can see a couple in there at the moment. Vignesh, could I read them out to you and maybe you can look to address them?
Sounds good, Ross.
All right, fantastic. So the first one I can see here is, do you support data masking?
Great question. So with Vault, our backup and recovery platform, we do support data masking when it comes to seed. So you can use a backup snapshot or multiple backup snapshots as source. And if you want to seed data from those snapshots into a target environment, you can perform that with data masking. And data masking in terms of Vault includes trimming strings and also making sure that they are not readable by the users in the target Salesforce system.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Another one that's come in here is, does Vault support all Salesforce metadata types?
Yeah, another great one. So with respect to the support for metadata types, we do support anything that falls under the metadata API bucket. So it is not just restricted to sales or service cloud. So if you go beyond those clouds, like a community cloud or marketing cloud, there's still some metadata types that fall under the MD API bucket, and we are still able to support that.
All right, superb. Thank you very much for that. If there are any other questions from, so they're the only questions we've got at the moment, Vignesh. Any other questions, please don't hesitate to put them in there. We've still got a little bit of time which we could table it. Okay, so once come, is Encino RBC supported? Is Encino RBC supported?
Great one. So Encino record-based configuration is supported. It was recently supported as part of the Vault application, probably 3 months back. So you can use all the Encino features like a product hierarchy, collateral type, user interface, branches, you name it. You will be able to take a backup of those objects that are part of those features and be able to restore off of it as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Vignesh. Look, if there are any others, please don't hesitate to put them through. While we're doing that though, look, if there's any part of either this session or just in general that you'd like to follow up on, there's a couple of contact details on the screen there. There's my email details, plus also my colleague Venkatesh. Please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us should you have any questions from today's sessions or anything with regards to where you think we might be able to help. Vignesh, I don't have any other fresh questions coming through at the moment. So maybe on that note, if I could thank you all very much for being able to join us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. It's been fantastic having you be part of today's session. Thank you to you, Vignesh, for running the bulk of what we went through. And again, any questions that we might be able to follow up on, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on all of those contact details that you can see on the screen. And on that note, thank you very much. We look forward to hopefully catching up with you again soon. Take care.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, everyone. Have a good one.